Try not to cough.
Wow.
Right, okay. Well, I've quite enjoyed writing this and preparing myself for this. I hope you can cope with it. I focus very much on councils. I've tried to pick out and learn things for myself, and I've tended to use Trotsky's 1905 and a bit of ICC stuff, and a couple of other leaflets anyway, to focus on working councils, what our view of working councils, perhaps I should say my view of working councils and workers' councils and class struggle, really. Midlands Discussion Forum has been introduced, so I don't need to repeat that. As I say, I don't tend to be an expert. I found preparing the discussion a useful task for myself, and I'm not trying to cover. I kept finding more and more elements I wanted to bring into it, either things that I didn't know about SBGB or things I wanted to find out about it, and so forth. So I've had to keep trimming it down and keeping it well focused. I think it's important. It's good for us to be here discussing this, because the SBGB, unlike the Labour Party, Stalinists, Trotskyists, genuinely believes in an overthrow of capitalism by the working class. It believes socialism as a class of society. It doesn't support reforms, and it doesn't turn nationalist and support ruling class in the event of imperialist wars. So there's an awful lot of common ground. These are very important issues which we have in common. So from my perspective, it's therefore a discussion within the workers' movement. I think Adam's got a sort of a label that he'll put on us as non-market socialists, but I don't quite see that there's anything, any such thing as a market socialist. So for us, it's a discussion within the workers' movement. But we do have sharply differing views on the path to socialism, and that's been the focus for today. And those differences are no doubt going to come out in the discussion. They're important we discuss them because they're key issues for future activities. But good and a lot of elements of them are things that are only going to be decided within future events. So I'm not going to focus too much on SBGB, what the SBGB says about different things. I'm not trying to pick it apart like that. I've got a couple of things to say at the end. In terms of workers' councils, I try to focus on the councils as organs of class struggle, because there's far more experience of that, rather than councils as organs of administration in some future global society, a socialist society. There's an awful lot more remains for clarification, it seems to me, so I'm staying away from that. First appearance of councils was in Russia in 1905, as a revolutionary situation was opening up across the capitalist world. It's no accident that this was also the period that saw the formation of the SBGB, when it split from the reformists. In Russia, there was a strong, concentrated working class suffering under a brutal and out-of-date regime, which used foreign capital to support itself. It was called absolutism. It was violently resisting encroachments from bourgeois society to change. And the councils emerged from 1903 onwards, when the confrontation was becoming ever deeper and greatly politicised. The strikes were, yes, based on everyday economic struggles, but were becoming political as they were thwarted by an aggressive and untrustworthy ruling class. There was no one specific point of origin for the councils, but lessons were being learnt in struggle, and the councils emerged as workers needed to join up together to fight united battles and, critically, to raise generalised political demands. Trotsky, in his history of 1905, describes how the structures grew out of the workers' struggles with the state, based simply on the need for assemblies and meetings in the workplace. Prolonged struggles led to the formation of factory committees to represent the assembly's decisions, and prolonged struggle then also generated the emergence of what came to be called Soviets, or as in English, councils. Ultimately, as the conflicts became broader and more political, these works assemblies became formalised and began to elect and send delegates with mandates to district and town councils, and in their turn these councils enabled decisions to be taken and implemented, which gave a strength to the workers that they didn't have separately. What's clear is that prior to 1905, no political organisations were calling for councils. No one was preparing workers to fight in this way. In a period of intense and politicised conflict, the need was still for discussion, but particularly for coordination and organisation to take those political struggles forward. Councils have therefore been a feature of periods of mass struggle. The setting up of a complex web of councils by October 1905 incorporated metal workers, textile workers, bakers, print and communication workers, and so on. The main centres, two main centres of industry were Moscow and Petersburg, but there were a lot of other towns as well with industry expanding. In Petersburg, the print and railway workers created councils which became the heart of the Central Petersburg Soviet. Raised demands relating to food supplies, rents, working day, civil liberties, freedom of assembly, and parliamentary freedoms and so forth. The Central Soviet in Petersburg, it began with about 100 delegates in early October and eventually comprised over 500 delegates representing more than 200 or about 200 workplaces, and drew support from a much broader range of workers and students, soldiers and sailors and state workers, etc. Trotsky points out that councils were not a means of pursuing passive or limited struggles, but enabled offensive struggles against the state. He described them as a natural organ of struggle, an authentic democracy, a workers' government in embryo. And from his the summing up chapter in the book 1905, he says, prior to the Soviet, we find among the industrial workers a multitude of revolutionary organisations directed in the main by the Social Democratic Party. But these were organisations within the proletariat, and their immediate aim was to achieve influence over the masses. The Soviet was from the start the organisation of the proletariat, and its aim was the struggle for revolutionary power. So the 1905 revolutionary wave was eventually defeated. The experience lived on nevertheless, and when a revolutionary situation re-emerged in 1917, workers began by recreating councils, and these organisations played a key role in driving the revolution forward a second time. 1917 was not simply a Bolshevik coup. The struggles at this time were based on a groundswell of militancy that gave more and more power and influence over events to the network of councils. The growing revolutionary consciousness of the working class, socialist consciousness of the working class, found an organisational structure where it could be expressed practically. And I think that's an important bit. During the middle of 1917, the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries gained control of the councils and turned them back into permanent committees, something that weakened the revolutionary movement from within. The Bolsheviks at the time also seemed to think that the councils were dead to the working class. But eventually the pressure of a rising revolutionary consciousness in the working class later in 1917 saw the councils pull back to revolutionary goals. And those that emerged were then based on direct control from below and had a strength and the vitality that the ruling class could not undermine, even with violence. Trotsky talks of the Soviets spreading right across Russia, of regional meetings with hundreds of delegates from local Soviets, so there was a really substantial network right across Russia. It was this agitation from below by the masses involved at the base level of the councils that pushed the revolutionary process forward and continually reaffirmed working class power when those at the head of the councils weakened. And a quote from Pannekerk now, I've got, from the book about workers' councils, from his book about workers' councils, where the action of the workers is so powerful that the very organs of government are paralysed, the councils have to fulfil political roles. Now the workers have to provide for public order and security. They have to take care that social life can proceed, and in this the councils are their organs. What is decided in the councils, the workers perform. So the councils grow into organs of social revolution. So, sort of some summaries of these experiences. From the bottom up, workers created structures that helped them fight the class struggle against capitalism. It helped them discuss and clarify themselves, as well as organise and plan and act. In essence, each factory or locality used assemblies that created committees with mandated and recallable delegates. These local assemblies and committees then sent recallable delegates, known as workers' deputies, to district and industry-based councils. The district-based councils sent delegates on to regional councils and so on. This structure enabled discussion and clarification, but it also united economic struggles to manage day-to-day life with political struggles to manage society as a whole. Ultimately, this is really important. The councils unite the economic and political in a way that political parties alone cannot. The councils also undertook the extension of struggles to involve key sectors outside of the original strikes, including the armed forces, for example, and then organised militias to protect working class districts from pogroms and state violence. They took decisions about the management of society that brought them into direct competition with the state. Finally, they also based themselves in practice on direct democracy, and they found themselves continually in conflict with the reformists and the bourgeoisie who prefer representative democracy by professionals. The councils were then a key part of a mass movement that was based on active participation by the working class. Parliamentary votes cannot create this, and in fact tend to work against that process. However, by 1919, it was the Bolsheviks themselves that weakened these organisations by moving power over to their own party structures, and therefore reducing the power of the councils. It's this error that we need to learn from, and not to simply reject the Bolsheviks because of the brutal state capitalist regime that the Soviet Union became. The Bolsheviks' mistake was tragic and major. In the end, they separated political struggle from the economic. The councils were left to simply organise the factories and work, and the political party took over the state power. Just so that I'm not just talking about Russia all the time, I've got a quote from the Icarus pamphlet, which is a report on the revolt in Wilhelmshaven in Germany. It's a summary quote though. The working class is in need of a movement, an entirely new movement based on working class solidarity, unification on the job, free and independent workers' councils in cadres of self-asserting fighting units, based on ships, rail, aircraft, workshops, pits, factories and agricultural communities. The workers do not require professional leaders. It says our confidential men, but I suspect that's a mistranslation of something like trusted there. But our confidential men shall be class-conscious comrades and teachers only, dismissible at any time by a vote of their direct electors. So that was his review of the experience of the use of councils in Germany in 1918, 1919 and so forth. So, as I say, I've tried to stress on what the workers' councils are, and in doing so I've particularly tried to make clear that they're based on the type of democratic structure that the SPGB itself calls for, this view of direct democracy. They're institutions, however, that can achieve far more than just economic management in the workplace, which I think is the SPGB view. So just to finish off, a couple of points to make about the SPGB's viewpoints. Firstly, because I'm sure SBGB members will want to dispute with the way I've used the term class struggle. We do agree that socialist consciousness is key to the way forward, but rather than recognise the link between economic and political struggles in the development of that consciousness, the SBGB rejects economic struggles as, I'm not quite sure if pointless is the right word, but unable to achieve anything, certainly, and sees important part of class struggle just as the struggle for political clarity. Therefore sees it only as a political or intellectual process, and it ends up with as a view that it's only the party that brings enlightenment to the class. This is a key weakness in its political view, one that raises the danger of a belief that the class struggle is simply the struggle to understand the SBGB, or worse, that it's simply discussion with and within the SBGB. In a roundabout way, the SBGB is making a similar mistake to the Bolsheviks by separating the two, the economic and the political. So, related to this is a view of class struggle is also the belief that Parliament can be used as a vehicle for that struggle. One expression used by the SPG that I particularly object to is the slogan I've seen about Parliament, why not give it a try? I mean, maybe members are going to turn around and say that was a weak slogan or something to start with, but it seems to be neatly to express, from my point of view, the SBGB's weaknesses, therefore, so fine, thanks for that. In 1904, when it formed, the SBGB was probably clearer than many other working class groups, particularly on social democracy and reformism, and certainly in Britain. 100 years later, I want to say, though, that this is no longer a realistic or a materialist view of working class experience. We have had much more experience of how Parliament functions in a class society, and we should have learned better than that. The bourgeoisie likes us to think of the world as divided between this good Western democracy and an underdeveloped world where dictators and bullies usurp power to maintain their own rule. In fact, if you take an overview of countries in the world, they are virtually all described as democracies within universal suffrage. There's only a few exceptions that don't meet that standard, as Saudi Arabia and United Arab Republics and Western Sahara for some reason. The real issue here is why on earth the ruling class would build and rely on an instrument to front its political system, which according to the SBGB makes revolution easier. I don't think that's a materialist viewpoint. The bourgeoisie's parliament is representative democracy, and this institution has shown itself to be an ideal figurehead and support for capitalism. I think that's materialism. So last point, in conclusion, SBGB correctly recognised that the working class is a revolutionary class because of its situation as an exploited class within capitalism. Only the working class can bring about socialism, nobody else. But this does not mean that it is just the experience of working for a wage that brings about this situation. It's also a product of the workers' whole experience of the labour market, of working contracts, conditions, state policies, and all the economic and political struggles that, with the ruling class, that flow from that situation. Economic and political strikes, mass protests, violent confrontations are part of that experience that raises working class consciousness, or can be part, that raises working class consciousness and makes it aware of its capacity to make a socialist revolution. The consciousness emerges because of its whole experience, not because political minorities have persuasive skills. That's it. So sorry if that was a bit long.
That's not about right. We started a bit late, so that's about.
Well, I understand it. This isn't a formal debate between between the Socialist Party and the MDF. Middle discussion forum. It's a general discussion under the topic of the role of workers' councils in the Socialist Revolution. But I must say that Phil talked more about the role of workers' councils in the bourgeois revolution in Russia in 1905. Now, there was actually an argument which you won't have heard about, going on about what should be the title of this meeting. The original title was Workers' Councils or Parliament, Which Way Forward to Socialism. Now, we objected to that on the grounds that that was, or could be interpreted as putting us in a position of defending just using Parliament, nothing else, to get to socialism. So the title has got changed. Maybe we could accept it something like Economic Action or Political Action, Which Way Forward to Socialism. But we need to define our terms. I think we're agreed on what socialism is. It's a worldwide society without frontiers, based on the common ownership and democratic control of the Earth's resources. It's a classless, stateless, moneyless, wageless society where production is carried on directly to meet people's needs, not for the market. So there's no buying and selling. I think we all agree that that is what socialism, other people call communism, but as far as we're concerned, socialism and communism are the same thing, and that's the objective. Now, the second word that needs defining, which there might be slightly less agreement on, is what do we mean by workers? Now, as far as we're concerned, anybody who is forced by economic necessity to go out onto the labour market to try to sell their physical and mental energies for a wage or a salary, they are a member of the working class. They're not just people who work in big factories. They're people, anybody who has to work, or economic necessity has to work or try to find work for a wage or a salary. They are members of the working class. I wouldn't go quite as far as the Occupy people and say 99% of the population are working class, but I mean, we are the 99%, sounds better than we are the 93.7%, but it's the overwhelming majority of the population in an industrialised country like Britain are members of the working class. And now we come to the definition of workers' councils. I'm going to take the definition given by the man you mentioned, Anton Pannekow, who wrote a book on this. This is how he defines and describes workers' council. The organisation of production by the workers is founded on free collaboration, no masters, no servants. The combination of all the enterprises into one social organisation takes place after the same principle. The mechanism for this purpose must be built up by the workers. Given the impossibility to collect the workers of all the factories in one meeting, they can only express their will by means of delegates. For such bodies of delegates in later times, the name of workers' councils has come into use. Every collaborating group or personnel designates the members who in the council assemblies have to express its opinions and its wishes. These took an active part themselves in the deliberations of this group. They came to the front as able defenders of the views that carried the majority. Now, on this definition, I think you confirmed it in your contribution, Phil, workers' councils are a variety of working class organisation at the point of production. They're the working class organised industrially or economically. Now, other varieties of this would be trade unions, industrial unions, one big union, and strike committees. Now, to answer your point, what attitude should revolutionary socialists take towards the economic organisation of the working class? Well, obviously, fully in favour of this. I mean, obviously, workers need to organise to resist the downward pressures that exist all the time on wages and working conditions under capitalism. But there's no need to give a preference to any particular form, as long as the workers are organised on democratic lines with the sort of election of delegates and majority decision making that was described by Pannekow. So, what is the role? The title of the meeting, what is the role of economic organisation of the working class in the social revolution? Like you, what about before or after? What would be their role? What could be their role in the course of the social revolution? Now, there's been one strand in the revolution tradition that has taken the view that these should play a leading role, should in fact be the instrument of social revolution. I mean, there's a syndicalist with their idea of a general strike to overthrow capitalism. There's the IWW with their idea that workers should simply take and hold means production. In fact, in this book, Pannekow too envisages the working class using strike action and occupations to confront and to eventually overthrow capitalism. Now, there's one big drawback to this approach. It leaves political control, that is, the control of the state machine and its instruments of coercion, it leaves these in the hands of the capitalist class. I mean, this is dangerous, this allows the capitalist class to keep a powerful instrument which can be used to oppose any industrial action. And this is why Marx, for one person, in his day always insisted on the need to first gain control of political power and to take it out of the hands of the capitalist class before attempting to overthrow capitalism and to replace it with socialism. I mean, it's what actually historically has distinguished Marxists, inverted commas, from anarchists. In fact, the debate this afternoon could well be an echo of those that took place over 100 years ago in the International Working Men's Association. Now, if you accept that there is a need to win control of political power, to take it out of the hands of the capitalist class, there are basically only two ways in which this can be done. One is armed insurrection, and the other is the ballot box. Now, in the 19th century, in most countries, the only way to have won control of political power would have been insurrection. Street battles and barricades, as widely occurred on the continent in 1848. Now, inevitably, this involved a minority leading mass of discontented people. Well, actually, in some cases, it was just a minority plotting to seize power without taking any notice of what ordinary people might have thought. Now, I would suggest that insurrection and minority action go together. I mean, this is the origin of the concept of the vanguard party. I mean, the vanguard party is an organisational form that was devised to lead an insurrection. And this is one good reason for opposing both insurrection and the vanguard party. I mean, historically, successful insurrections led by a vanguard party, as for instance in Russia in 1917, have led, inevitably, I would suggest, not to a classless society, but to some of the leaders of the vanguard party evolving into a new ruling class, generally on the basis of state capitalism. But in any event, today an insurrection is obviously completely out of the question on practical grounds, as both the IWW and Panicat himself at least recognised. So what about elections as a way to win control of political power? Now, Marx himself did not rule this out, even in his day, as long as certain political conditions were met, and he said so publicly. I mean, the conditions that he had in mind were a stable political structure, a government that was responsible to an elected lawmaking body, and a majority of working class electors. And he specifically mentioned Britain as an example of this. Now, later, Lenin and Trotsky tried to argue that in the 20th century this was no longer possible, as conditions in Britain had become more like those what existed on the continent in the 19th century. Now, actually, I suggest the opposite has been the case. In the course of the 20th century, political conditions in other countries have become more like those in Britain. In fact, these now exist in most industrially developed capitalist countries. So today, the only practical way to win control of political power is through the ballot box, backed up, I hasten to add, of course, by a majority of socialist-minded workers, democratically self-organised outside Parliament. But even if this were not the case, even if the ballot box was not the way to win political power, this would still not be a reason for revolutionaries not to contest elections. I mean, elections are a way of challenging pro-capitalist parties and politicians so they don't get a free run. They're a way of spreading socialist consciousness, and if a socialist is elected as a delegate of those who voted for them, this secures a tribune from which to campaign against capitalism and for socialism. And the majority of MPs in favour of the social revolution would add legitimacy to it while taking it away from the capitalist class. And don't forget, as you've explained, that the capitalist class claims a rule on the basis of democratic agreement. If that is withdrawn publicly, then that particular defence of their position falls. I would say that there's no case at all for not contesting elections on principle. I mean, there's certainly a strong case for not voting for pro-capitalist candidates and abstaining when this is the only choice, which is what we in the Socialist Party do. We recommend that any workers that want socialists do. But it's not a case for never putting up revolutionary socialist candidates when this is practical. I mean, anti-electoralism is an anarchist dogma, and the onus is on those who are against ever contesting an election to make out a coherent case, which I suggest they can't do. I mean, the main objection that seems to be that any socialist delegate elected or sent to Parliament as a delegate will be co-opted into the establishment. Now, this has, of course, been the experience of Labour and Social Democratic parties all over the world. But who is advocating, or who here is advocating this sort of electoral activity? I mean, certainly not us. I mean, quite apart from thinking and spreading the illusion that capitalism can be reformed to work in the interest of wage and salaries, they put their candidates forward as leaders who, if elected, are going to do things for people. I mean, they're MPs, that's their leaders, they're not delegates. Now we envisage, or we kind of envisage a quite different kind of electoral politics. Workers, when they have become socialists, organise themselves into a mass democratic party on the same basis as Panacott envisaged for his Workers' Council, so that no leaders, only mandated and recallable delegates. Any socialist MP would simply be the delegate of those who elected them, just as anybody elected to some central body of workers' councils would be. I'll ask you this: if this would work, as you claim, for industrial organisation, why wouldn't it work for political organisation? After all, it's the same people, the same workers will be involved, organise themselves in the one case in the places where they work, and in the other in the places where they live. Incidentally, organising people in the places where they live enables to take into account people who are unemployed, or people who are retired, or people who are not working, which is, I think, an objection to workers' councils being the sole possible organisations of the working class. Now, if you wanted, you could even regard the mass socialist political party as a sort of workers' council. It too will be made up of workers organised on the basis of delegate democracy. Now, this concept of a workers' party is quite different from that both of the reformists, I mean, basically, let's say a party led by professional politicians and by trade union bosses, and of the Leninists, who see it as a vanguard of professional revolutionaries who know better than the rest of the working class. I mean, basically, it's the working class organised politically, just as the unions or workers' councils are the working class organised industrially. Okay, to come to the title of the meeting, what would be the role of workers' economic organisations in the socialist revolution? Because I mean, they still will have a role, even if they are incapable of overthrowing capitalism on their own. I mean, essentially, I suggest this would be to keep production going and to prepare to physically take over the workplaces and run them after the abolition by political means of the political structure that maintains capitalism. Okay, but now we enter in the realm of speculation. But it is possible to imagine the political and economic organisations of the working class being joined in a single socialist movement, with each section having its specific task: the political to win control of the state, and the economic to keep production going. You know, one big political and economic union of the working class, if you like. This would help deal with a hypothetical situation, which some people say would arise or might arise. That is, in the event of the last capitalist government refusing to accept a socialist election victory. If this happened, then the socialist majority will have to force them to accept it. And apart from street demonstrations organised by the Workers' Socialist Party, there could be political strikes organised in conjunction with the workers' economic organisations. But in any event, once there's a socialist majority, socialism is going to come about one way or another. It won't be able to be stopped. So, to sum up, and yes, workers should organise themselves democratically at their place of work, but this can take a variety of forms. It can take the form of industrial unions, Panacott's workers' councils, the IWW's one big union. I mean, there's no need to make a fetish of one particular organisational form. What is important is that whatever form it takes, there should be democratic control by the members. And secondly, workers also need to organise democratically in the places where they live into a mass democratic socialist political party which will contest elections with a view to winning control of the state from the capitalist class and the representatives who currently control it and to use it to uphold capitalist property rights. Thirdly, that the role of workers' economic organisations as such will be to keep production going and, if need be, to help back up the socialist electoral victory. Now, once capitalism has been abolished, they could or they can form the initial basis for the democratic management of production. But since classes, including the working class, will have been abolished, it won't be appropriate to call them workers' councils, to talk about workers' councils existing in socialism. I mean, there won't be any workers because there won't be any class. There'll just be free and equal men and women running industry and society through simple, plain, democratic councils. That's my contribution to the discussion.
Great, less than 20 minutes.
Less than 20 minutes.
You're very speaking.
Oh.
Well, I hope that's given enough people to sort of chew on. Just throw yourselves into it. If it looks like it's going to get into a melee or argument about who goes next. So here we are, let's get an anarchist.
Yeah, let's get the anarchist.
Good, yeah.
Actually, it's interesting listening to both sides today. I'm sorry, I forgot what your name.
Phil.
Phil. Hi, Phil. It's. I think you're a little bit. So I've got disagreements with you over the. What was it you said that it was at 1917 not being a Bolshevik coup, but that's another discussion elsewhere. All right. My disagreement is actually a whole different ball game. That. All right. But listen to what Adam said. One thing that he said was it leaves political. The Workers' Council is political control in the hands of the capitalist class. Well, I don't think that's true because, as I see it, and as I think as you were explaining, the Workers' Council, that model of Workers' Council, combines its political and economic, unless you're looking at quite a narrow definition of politics, i.e. parliamentarism, ballot box. And I think revolutionary socialist politics has gone long beyond that now. And you have to look at it on the other side of it. What does, if allegedly workers' councils leave political control in the hands of the capitalist class, what does Parliament do? Then, because Parliament is the creation of the capitalist class, creation of the bourgeoisie. It's been set up and designed in the image of the bourgeoisie. At least one thing you could say about workers' councils is the opposite is true. You know, in fact, parliamentarism can't actually arrive at anything. I don't think. But yeah, I'll leave it for now. Let someone else get a dig in.
Just go in, yeah.
Well, a couple of points. Phil spent quite a lot of time talking about Russia and some of the events of the Russian Revolution. Russia was a most inappropriate country for any type of revolution remotely resembling a socialist one, because at the time that the revolution took place, Russia was predominantly a rural country. Okay, in the 1890s it had industrialised to a certain extent. Marx back in the 1860s thought that Russia was one of the most unlikely of countries to have a revolution in the socialist sense. 20% of the population approximately in Russia were workers. Most of the rest were living in the countryside and were peasants. So it wasn't really, admittedly, Lenin and the Bolsheviks thought that the revolution would supposedly expand to other parts of Europe. But as we know, in spite of certain uprisings that took place after the end of the First World War in places like Bavaria and Hungary, I think it was as well. But they didn't get very far. The other point that I just wanted to make, and why the SPGB emphasises the importance of gaining control of Parliament and the state so that it can't be used against the revolutionaries. And and the point is that the state has control of the police force and the military. Now, the point is that if we don't get control of the police and the military, then there's always the very distinct possibility that they could be used against us. So certainly workers' councils are extremely important. Economic organisation, a measure of increased democracy for the revolutionary change amongst the working class. Workers' councils, I would say, as a socialist, are vital. But at the same time, we must be sure that the state is not merely neutralised, but taken over democratically by class-conscious working class people, a majority of the population, who will be able to put socialist delegates into Parliament so that it can't be used against us, but can be used in our favour to facilitate revolution to socialism.
There's a couple of points that I'd like to bring up there from that last contribution. One is on the unfitting nature of Russia for a socialist revolution. I keep having an argument on the internet with members of the SPGB where I ask them why they are so convinced that the SPGB was mistaken to found itself in 1904 on the basis that the task of the working class was to fight for socialism because there was no longer a kind of perspective for the working class to advance its interests through reformism. The SPGB, and I think Phil said this in his presentation, was in 1904 one of the clearest political groups of the proletariat in saying that the period of when the working class had some kind of interest in, or there was a possibility for the working class to struggle for demands inside capitalism. The SPGB in 1904 said that this era was finished and the working class's task was now to struggle for a socialist society. It took the revolutionaries in the Second International another 10 years to, well, perhaps not Panakuk. I think Panakuk may have only taken a couple of years, but Luxemburg and Lenin and Trotsky, it took them another 10 years to come around to this, the position that the SPGB had, that the tasks of capitalism were finished and now the proletarian revolution was on the agenda. And it was the First World War to the revolutionaries inside the Second International that was the definitive sign that capitalism was finished as a progressive social system. Now the SPGB argues, members of the SPGB, I don't know whether it's official SPG policy, but members of the SPGB argue that Russia was unfit for a revolution in 1917. Now, if capitalism is finished in 1904, why is Russia unfit for a revolution in 1917? Because capitalism is a world system, and if, as a world system, it has fulfilled its historic tasks of developing a proletariat, developing production, and developing the world market, and developing international communications to the point where socialism is possible in 1904, then a revolution in 1917 in Russia, it makes no difference that 80% of the population of Russia was peasantry, because socialism is possible as a world system. Okay? The notion that there is a national revolution for socialism, and it's you look at the conditions in one specific country and say this country is not ready for socialism. No country is ready for socialism. Britain now is not ready for socialism. There cannot be socialism in one country, and therefore the idea that the Russian Revolution was premature or ill thought out or in the wrong place is a ludicrous notion, because it relies on the idea that any one country could ever be ready for socialism, which it never will be, because socialism can only be a worldwide new society produced by the international proletariat. So that's the first thing. The second question is on the idea that the only functions of the workers' councils are going to be economic. Now, I think those of us who don't see the parliamentary road to socialism, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say the parliamentary road to socialism. Those of us who don't see that Parliament can be a useful way that the working class can exercise its political control in a revolutionary situation, would see that the councils themselves would be controlling aspects of society that the members of the SPGB would seeing as being part of the state. In the revolution, as far as I'm concerned, the one organisation that has a right to put armed workers on the streets is the workers' councils. The militias will be based on the factory councils, and either subject to the factory councils or, I would argue, to the local Soviets, which are not
what
just...
militias are you talking about? Sorry, you threw in militias there.
armed workers.
Armed workers?
Yes.
And where are they going to get these arms from?
Well, some of
It's
the...
illegal, isn't it?
Yes. Revolutions are illegal.
No, they're not.
I'm not going to get these terms. Let's
Right,
just
okay.
let him finish, and then
So the-
fair point to ask.
in terms of
Where are we going to get these
content,
socialist candidates from?
in
Crack
terms,
on, yeah.
right, I'll try. The Soviets, the local councils are going to be, I would suspect, a mixture of directly elected delegates from the factory committees, but also from neighbourhood councils. And I mean, the question of how do you integrate the unemployed and pensioners into the workers' council system is that not everybody in the district Soviet is going to be directly elected from a factory, okay, or wherever else the working class is working. And I quite agree that a lot of workers are not in factories; they're in call centres and they're in a whole bunch of other places that will very quickly, during the revolution, cease to have any useful social function, because an awful lot of economic activities under capitalism are not necessary for the continuance of life, just life as we know it.
Hold on.
Oh,
Sorry, Dave.
it's okay. Have we got any more chairs?
We've got space along here.
So by saying workers' councils, we shouldn't just take this as being the factory committee, just the committees of workers elected at the point of production, or not just the mass assemblies in workplaces or the delegates of those mass assemblies. There are also neighbourhood councils that take up questions like how the sewage system works in the neighbourhood, the question of power supply to residential districts. It's not just about the question of how you organise production. It's the workers' councils organise the whole of social life. But I shall leave that as my three contributions, even though I've only written down two here. But I shall leave that as my three contributions and hand over to someone else.
I mean, sorry, do you want to come back in now? Or?
Well, I'd like to pick up this point about militias. It seems to be a highly dangerous policy to be advocating, and I think it gets to the behind it is the heart of the problem, it seems to be, and that is that what the revolution would be doing would be to take over the means of production from one class, from the class and making it and making the means of production commonly owned by everybody. Now, if we think that that is going to be an easy task and is not going to be resisted forcibly, if necessary, well, if they can get away with it by the capitalist class, then you live in cow cuckoo land. And that is why, and I think this is the point that Vince was making, it is essential to capture the political power of the state, which is by parliament, so that the socialists could run the military. Because you can't suddenly, I mean, you'd be falling into the worst trap possible by starting to give people arms to go around and physically, with violence, take over factories. Because that would be like manna from heaven to the capitalist class. They send in their highly trained squads of the military and literally shoot you down. And that's a highly dangerous and irresponsible policy to be advocating.
Sorry, you want to come in and then you again, unless anybody else. Oh, and you want. Well, all right, 1, 2, 3. All right.
Okay.
I'll throw my hands up.
There's a lot of particular points which people have made, which certainly worth coming back on. The idea that workers' councils in the current period, if and when they emerge, will very much mirror what was in Russia 100 years ago, based on big factories and so on. I think the point's well made that the nature of the working class in the metropolitan countries now is different than how we were in Russia 100 years ago. And I'm sure that workers' councils, when they emerge, will include area-based formations that will include, as you say, unemployed workers who aren't centred around big centres of production, because in most of Europe, in North America even, there's not the same concentrations of workers in massive workplaces as indeed there were in parts of Russia, which is why the Soviets were able to emerge there. But I think there's a much more fundamental issue about what Adams called winning political power, and what the comrade in the corners just referred back to, because it seems to me that that's where the real difference is between those who see a struggle within, including a parliamentary framework like the SPGB, and those of us who don't see that as part of the struggle for socialism, is that actually winning political power is a bit of a strange formulation. We have to decide which class holds political power at any given time. And I'm sure we all agree that currently the bourgeoisie right across the globe hold political power, and they do that whether there's military juntas in place, whether there's parliaments in place, whether there's fascist dictatorships in place. All of those are forms of bourgeois rule. Different political complexions, but all forms of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, hidden behind one form or another. And when we're talking about political power, it seems to me that we're not just talking about what the working class created at the start of this century in terms of the Workers' Council, but Marx himself, in reaction to the history that he lived through, actually saw that it's not a quest for the working class to establish power. It's not a question of taking hold of the existing state institutions and moulding them to our will. The Paris Commune for Marx is a sharp breaking point in that what it actually shows is that it's not a question of struggling to take hold of Napoleon III's state or the Prussian state, which dominated whole chunks of France at that time, but they're in fact in the sharpness of struggle for control of society. The working class actually has to create its own organs, and those organs are actually sharply distinct from the tools which the bourgeoisie use to control, and Parliament is one of those tools. So what we get at the start of the 20th century isn't groups of radical Marxists inventing things, are actually building on the lessons that Marx had learned in 1870 and 71. And they're doing that, and the SPGB's birth is also part of the same process of fighting against the degeneration of political understanding that had taken place in the Second International. And I think Phil's already mentioned Trotsky's Results and Prospects in 1905, where he actually understands why and how the working class are beginning to express their own political dynamic. But also the other significant work, I think you point to it around almost identical time, is Luxemburg's The Mass Strike, where actually what Luxemburg is doing is rediscovering the revolutionary essence of Marxism, which the Second International, and particularly the German SPD, had poured whole layers of misunderstanding around. So this revolutionary essence in terms of working class self-activity and the working class creating their own organisations is what differentiates, for me, revolutionary struggle for socialism away from something which wants to play within the confines of bourgeois rule, because Parliament, it isn't the be-all and end-all of the bourgeois state by a very long chalk. But certainly in this country, it's a well-established element of bourgeois rule, and to imagine that somehow that by electing socialist representatives to Parliament, that somehow that will negate the ability of the army to crush the working class, or that it will negate the will of the bourgeoisie to exercise their economic dictatorship, just seems to me to be clearly flying in the face of reality. And I think that's where the sharp difference is that when we talk about political power, we always understand the political power is based on which class is in control, and you can't mudge and fudge, you can't hack away at bourgeois rule by entering Parliament.
Yeah, on that little side issue of militias,
Yeah.
I think it is a side issue. I don't think it's that important really, because it's been made of this, or people running around with guns or something like that. Well, if the Socialist Party are talking about taking control of Parliament, okay, on the basis that would protect whatever revolutionary gains they were having a socialist majority, yada yada yada, right? Then surely that would only protect anybody by having control of the state and control of the army and so on and so forth, right? That's how it seems to me. Whereas when you're talking about workers' militias, you're talking about something that comes under the control of workers' councils, right? That would be there to defend those organisations. As I say, that's a side issue. What really has got me thinking is this idea that, well, does anyone actually believe that who controls Parliament holds political power? Because it's a side job. Cameron doesn't hold power, and there was a guy before who forgot. Brown. Well, he didn't hold power, right? Power is held by a much wider, much wider entities than that. Okay, the whole establishment that is basically one side of the capitalist system, a facet of the capitalist system. Whoever gets into Parliament, I mean, if you have a socialist majority, if you had every single seat was filled by a socialist, they wouldn't hold political power, because you still have that establishment. It doesn't make any sense.
The power, political power, is held by the government, whoever has control of the police and the armed forces, because they are the elements of violence and state control. And if they are responsible, at least technically and de facto as well, to the government. The other point that what I wanted to raise, why I mentioned Russia earlier on, was because really it was the reason why this revolutionary feeling swept Russia was because of the enormous suffering that people on both the war front and in the cities were experiencing because of their involvement in the First World War. But really, Russia was the most backward country and probably the least likely country in the world to set socialism on the road. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they realised that the revolution could only spread if it had support from many other industrial countries, which of course never happened significantly. Okay, we know there were small uprisings in Germany and Hungary and one or two other countries like that. But as I said, Marx was right. And the other point was about autocracy. There was no tradition whatsoever of democracy in Russian history. There was a little bit in Novgorod going right back to the 11th century amongst a small section of the population. And of course, you mentioned the Soviets, which were significant in 1917. But there were there'd been no significant elections apart from the Duma, but that was well under control of the government and the Tsar. So you're talking about an attempt there which was bound to fail unless it had support from the far more industrialised countries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you want to speak, and well, I don't know, speakers. So
Oh,
kind of
I'm
keep
not
the
allowed.
speakers in reserve a bit. Well, if nobody else wants
I'm
to
not
speak.
allowed.
Well, he keeps pulling the elbow over here. I said, look, you brought your gang along. You can't expect to speak as well, you know. Well, so yeah, so
Brought even a lecture along.
you go, and then if anyone else, and then if it dies down a bit, we'll get our two speakers to chip in again, shall we?
Right, first of all, on the question of the appropriateness of Russia to the place of the revolution should take place. I'm not saying the Works Council in Russia should necessarily be a blueprint for what's a future critical situation or revolutionary situation. But I would say the reason the revolution or situation came about in Russia is because of the circumstances. Russia was a backward country. It's an absolutist regime in the Tsar, and things have reached breaking point. And the First World War proved to be the point where straw broke, so to speak, camels, straw broke sort of thing. So, that's what happened. I mean, 1905, of course, was an essential sort of rehearsal for 1917, if you like, because apart from anything else, the Works Council arose at that time, and the important thing is, no political at that time actually realised how they actually came about, but they were formed, as an alternative by workers themselves, as a means of organising not just economics or production, but an alternative way of organising society. But there weren't a blueprint on any sort of political thing. They happened through necessity because of what happened at the time. Of course, in 1905, an interesting thing that no one's mentioned so far is that we saw at first hand state repression when people like state sort of functionaries were posing as workers' leaders like Father Gapon and other sorts of things actually led the workers to the slaughter, and the Tsar actually gave a free hand to the authorities, and there was bloodshed. And that was a critical moment because workers and ordinary people in Russia, the peasants, the most backward strata, realised for the first time the true nature of the state. And that was a crucial thing as far as preparing the sort of movement that was to exist at the time. And at that time, of course, politicos actually split as to what kind of revolution was happening in Russia. There was the Mensheviks, which on the right of the social revolutionaries, which were the peasants' parties, who believed in sort of classical Marxist terms that Russia was backwards. It hadn't had the experience of the West, and therefore it had to go through the same sort of procedure. It had to bourgeois democratic regime, which would actually, take society forward to reach the point where a revolution was to take place. Whereas the Bolsheviks and the left SRs realised that could no longer happen, because capitalism by that time, was basically moved into a new phase where it's exhausted all its possibilities. Things like, bourgeois democratic regime or its associations like Parliament could no longer be a progressive thing. It could only serve forces of reaction. So it recognised the need to go forward, an institutional social revolution at that time. But, the works councils at that time, workers and peasants were forced by the reality, political and economic reality, to go forward and organise society. Because once the Tsar regime fell at the February Revolution because of the First World War, it was impossible, to basically continue the war and carry on in the sort of same sort of bourgeois economic thing. So the provisional governments came in, and one by one, they were just completely, paralysed. They could not simply organise or, really do anything. So you had a sort of situation of dual power between provisional governments and the councils, works councils at the time. Unfortunately, it represents a sort of lesson that the works councils aren't just economic or political things. I mean, a lot of councillors, for example, are accused of narrowing things down to economics. And one of the main lessons of the revolution at that time was that a lot of them, actually did concentrate on economics and didn't sort of take up political sort of things of the state. But the committees, the factory committees, the factory committees and works councils had the potential to go much further than they did. And unfortunately, they let sort of the representatives sort of take over. And the two sorts of the bourgeois democratic and the Bolsheviks, which believed in sort of sort of strong centralised states which could serve as a transition, and lead the works to socialism. Unfortunately, over a period of time, obviously through sort of isolation as well as the sort of political rule by one party, the works council sort of lost. They sort of lost the meaning, sort of thing. It became, Phil mentioned earlier on, administration sort of things. And that's all it became sort of mere sort of shadows for the government and the trade unions. And unfortunately, that's where, the defeat of the whole thing came. And this had an effect internationally. To start off with, the sort of 1917 was an inspiration to the workers worldwide. Unfortunately, as time went on, that proved to be the other way around. And so it's had a sort of a negative effect, worldwide. But I think one of the main lessons we need to learn is that, we talk about taking over of the political and economic process. It's only the mass organisations themselves that can do this. We talk about things being illegal and where you're going to get guns from. Where are we going to get these candidates? Socialism. It's a bit, it seems a bit unrealistic to me that a mass army could sort of enter Parliament.
It's a candidate, socialist
Yeah.
candidate.
How many are there? How many are there at the moment?
How many?
650. Sort of
Well, we're going
representative.
to contest the South East region and the European Parliament election with a list of 10 candidates.
Okay.
It's my opinion.
Start
My
recess.
finished, yeah. It's my opinion that it has to be mass organisations that organise direct political and economic control.
You can be a candidate.
All right. That's just
But
a side
I think
question.
but in my opinion, we're making a fatal mistake, and these are things we need to learn from the past. If we allow either, sort of democratic representatives to sort of run the show, or we rely on vanguard parties, because the state needs to be neutralised. Well, not neutralised exactly. It needs The councils need to take over the political and economic runnings of society. And that's the only way you can sort of overthrow the bourgeoisie and all the enemy classes. You know, otherwise you leave them in control, or one way or another, you need sort of re-establish control, or a new ruling class will arise through the revolutionary process. So, you know, that's the only sort of way you can do it, through a council system, as opposed to either Bolshevik or social democratic ways of doing, you know, way forward. Oh, that's what else we're going on.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking Algeria. I think 15, 20 years ago, the Islamists won the general election, so the state banned them, and they never got into power. But I'm actually a bit confused with the CP, the position, because I was reading a LibCom thread, and I think I don't know if the person's there, but there was an SPGB person saying that using the elections as a measure to gauge social working class opinion, kind of thing, and then on that, so you've got that on one hand, then you've got the thing on the other hand where in this meeting a couple of people have said that we've got to have a socialist majority in Parliament, otherwise we won't control the state. So I'm not kind of sure what the position is, what you're kind of arguing. That was basically a question to the comrades.
I think they argue both, don't they?
But you've got to have both. Is that what you're saying?
Sorry. Do you want to answer that? I can give you an opportunity to answer
I mean,
the question.
there are two separate arguments going. One is most people in the group, except for people from the Socialist Party, are against contesting elections under any circumstances. You're anti-parliamentary. I wasn't going to say anti-parliamentary cretins, but you're anti-parliamentary fetishes. You're just against anything to do with elections. That's one argument. Now I could mention. I mean,
That's not what I'm. That's not kind of what I'm saying. What I'm asking is.
That's the one argument. But I mean, that's a weak argument from your point of view, because both Marx. If you imagine, I'm not Adam Buick of the Socialist Party, but Marx or Trotsky or Rosa Luxemburg or Lenin. All these people agree with contesting elections. They don't necessarily agree with the contesting elections will give you control of political power. So you're arguing against two different things. Your basic argument, you should never contest an election, but that is not the position of Marx, it's not the position of Trotsky, it's not the position of Luxemburg, it's not the position of Lenin.
Because they were wrong. Yeah.
Okay, I'm saying you can say they were wrong. So the other argument is, as Vincent said, it is in fact in a stable political country like Britain, not like Algeria. Whoever has a majority in Parliament, the government has to be responsible for that. I mean, why do you think Cameron is the Prime Minister and not Brown? And why do you think that when they had a vote in Parliament to go to war in Syria, the vote went against the government didn't go to war? You know, I mean, who is this mysterious establishment? How are they chosen? You know, are they sort of puppet masters sort of doing this with the? No, I mean, it's silly. The government does control the armed forces. Even in these floods, the government says to the armed forces, "You go and build sandbags." It's so whoever does. I mean, put it this way: if a government couldn't exist without a parliamentary majority, and if there was a majority of socialist delegates in Parliament, the government would just lose legitimacy. It couldn't be the government.
Okay.
You didn't really answer the question,
Well,
but anyway.
still didn't answer your question.
I didn't answer the question. Well, I did answer the question. If you have a majority of socialists in Parliament, that will.
No, that was my
No,
first
no,
point.
can
I did make
I
a second
just-
point.
I'll just make one comment on that, which is because Adam said all these other people supported elections. Most of them didn't support elections as a means of gaining control of the state. They supported it as a means of measurement at a given period in the struggle. If you go on the LibCon thing that Adam posted, there's a whole debate about the fact that the Bolsheviks themselves saw it as useful at certain points, but not through the whole process, as a means of gauging their strength, at which point they decided to abandon it. But that's not. So, you know.
These arguments don't make much sense. But
All right, go on.
I was going to say that Marx himself believed that if you got a parliamentary majority, that would give you control of the state.
So they also had different views at different times.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on Marx's evaluation of the experience of the Paris Commune, because I would put forward an argument which says that arising from that, Marx actually crystallises quite a firm view that the working class can't just grab hold of the bourgeois state machine and use it to their own ends.
I agree with that.
Yeah, right. Well, we come on to that, but
just,
I mean,
just one thing.
well, very quick, and then
Well, no,
I'm going to
I
let you come back.
Marx made a speech in
I don't know what to
1872,
say now.
which is after
What?
the Paris
Oh,
Commune,
sure.
after the Paris Commune, saying that in certain countries, Britain, Holland, and he mentioned some others, it would be possible for the working class to gain control of political power peacefully through the ballot box. That was after the Paris Commune. But anyway, this is a silly argument because what Marx said doesn't settle anything. In fact, this part of this debate is a bit disappointing. We're talking about what Marx says, and we're talking about what happened in Russia 100 years ago. We're not talking about it today. Anyway, his turn.
Sorry, I think you'd better come in now. Right, if
We're
you
gonna
can
suggest
remember
have a
what you're
break.
going to say. Sorry?
We can suggest having a break.
I'll let Phil come back
Oh, right.
and we'll have a break.
Well, we'll let Phil have a quick one, and then we're going to have a short
Always
break.
wanted a
Short break, right?
one.
The people who want to get a drink. So 10 minutes. No more than 10 minutes, preferably. Okay,
What I
go on.
wanted to say, I'm going to come back a bit because I was quite surprised to Vic. We're obviously going to have a further discussion later. But I was surprised to hear that sort of. The point I want to take up is socialism has to be a world revolution. Well, socialism has to take over the whole world. Otherwise, capitalism still exists and control and will regain control. And I think that's a really important. I would have thought that was something that the SPGB agreed with as a world socialist movement. It has to be something that eliminates capitalism entirely to be able to make a socialist society out of it. So I'm a bit surprised to find so much emphasis placed on backwardness in Russia and so forth. Yes, that's part of the conditions that were faced there, but 20% of the workforce on a very large country meant there was a lot of industry there, and it was focused in particular areas. So there were really substantial factories and really substantial industries in, yes, admittedly specific areas of Russia. And you can't just write that off. But Vic said that because it was backward, Russia was therefore isolated and couldn't win. Couldn't become socialist because it was isolated. But that's true for every single country. We won't see a socialist revolution that takes over every country at one point in time. It's bound to be a staged process. There is therefore bound to be countries that become isolated and are waiting for the rest of the working class to come forward, or waiting for a socialist revolution in other countries as well. So the fact that Russia becomes isolated is the main point there. That yes, I agree, it couldn't have succeeded without having spread to other countries, but that makes all the arguments about the conditions in Russia as totally irrelevant. The point was, and I think they said, irrespective of your view of the Bolsheviks, there was a working class revolution. There's a revolution from below, and you can criticise the role of Bolsheviks and what they had to say at different points in time, but it doesn't go against that. And that is the key point that we have to look at when we're talking about Russia. I suppose I want to ask another question. Maybe that's something we can come back to. It's a bit unfortunate, but Adam from the start and various other people as well have kept focusing on the councils as purely an economic role. Certainly the pamphlet, I mean, that certainly agrees with the pamphlet I've been reading, the one about Parliament. I can't remember the proper title now. Or What's Wrong with Parliament, isn't it? That seems to suggest that SPGB's view of workers' councils is that they really only come into being when you've won control of Parliament as a way of reorganising the workplace.
I could argue both sides. I think I'll come in one day.
Yes.
I'll present
Perhaps
each
you
of
should
your positions.
do that as a
Against
role of
both
the chairman, saying what's going on.
It's not what we say.
I think what I stressed and what I was trying to stress in the presentation was that it was much more than an economic role. You can't separate that off and say simply there's a workplace organisation and a political organisation. The whole point of the socialist revolution is that it involves the masses from below, and the only way I've seen that happening is via workers' councils, and the examples I was using were in Petersburg and Moscow, but also we're talking about Bavaria and northern Germany as well, where the councils, because they've come so powerful in opposing the state, because the strikes that they are involved in managing are disrupting the capitalist state and capitalism so much, they are taking on a role which it's not competitive with the state, it was an alternative state, if you like. They are taking over those functions in opposition to that state. It is a political role and an economic role that is being performed. And I do want to stress that I don't think it is just a workplace management.
Yeah, okay.
It's about the whole, okay.
No,
That's fair enough. I mean,
clearly.
that's the point I'm trying to prod more out of the SPGB on their views there.
Okay. Can we have a 10-minute break? And how long are we going on for roughly?
We've got it till 6, but I can go on.
If anybody else has got fighting to say a few things, anybody want to chip in already? Well, there were a few points I wanted to make. The trouble is I haven't put them in any order. Some are just, how can I put, bullet points really. I haven't really had time to think these through. One was, as I was just chatting with Adam, I quite liked his reference to having workers' councils as a backup to the vote. The only reason I thought that was interesting was because that was the old SLP line with industrial unions, of course, and the SLP and the SPGB having some historic origins in common, but having battled it out with each other, I thought it was just a nice thing to see a member of the SPGB arguing the old SLP line. But nonetheless, now the point is, as I understand it, from the discussions we've been having on LibCom around these themes, mainly with Adam and myself and a couple of other people, of course you accept that there may be some circumstances where the franchise isn't available, and you accept that in those circumstances you would have to have some other form of workers' self-organisation in order to carry a revolutionary situation forward. So I suppose one of the things that's at the back of my mind is always that everybody assumes that things as they are now, at their best, from the SPG's point of view, because we know that not every country has an easily accessible franchise system. They may have a franchise of some sort, but whether it can be used or not is a sort of secondary issue. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. But can any of us really predict where we're going to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time in terms of the situation with regarding the availability or otherwise of a vote, of a franchise? Everybody just seems to assume that things will carry on as they are, and I find that in itself strange, that people think that they've got some kind of crystal ball on the basis of their understanding of how capitalism just happens to be now, and particularly how it happens to be in countries that perhaps we're most familiar with, that's going to carry on forever. But I can't see that that's necessarily the case. But the reason why those of us that do favour some form of workers' councils and assemblies, and I think as various people have said, we shouldn't just see that as a narrow model that might have emerged in Russia or Germany in 1918, but simply as the basic idea that workers in the course of struggles in the here and now will create mechanisms to express their point of view, because it happens all the time, doesn't it? We see it all the time. And even on a very mundane level, you often see that in workers to progress a strike in a difficult situation, that they may operate through trade unions, but rather than not, what most workers face is, for a start, they've got 3 trade unions, or they've got different trade unions. I mean, even the IWW is trying to organise, and it's very militant, but in most places, as a matter of fact, of course, the IWW at its best or the average anarcho-syndicalist union like the Solfed or whatever, what are they actually going to have? They're going to have a minority of people in a particular workplace. So and in fact, the only way any kind of militant, organised activity can happen is to go outside of that framework, outside of a situation where you're reliant on one particular trade union and one particular radical trade union or whatever. So things like strike assemblies, strike committees, or councils of some form or another are things that are generated all the time in nearly every place you can think of where the working class exists. And that all that is the embryo of workers' self-organisation of their own struggle. What all that leads on to is, well, what is the relationship? What are the conditions in which we might conceive of, we might conceive of workers moving from a situation where they've got experience of organising themselves in everyday struggles in a militant way to look after their own interests. In what situation, in what conditions could we imagine that level of awareness and practical organisation actually moving on to something that could at least bear some kind of resemblance to what most of us regard as a socialist awareness or a communist awareness or consciousness? How can one proceed to the other? Because if there's got to be a connection. If there is no connection, all you're left with is trying to convince the workers through your own educational efforts. Now, if there's got to be more than just trying to convince people by your own educational efforts, i.e. the little minorities of all of us, put us all together, right? The CWO, the YIT, the AF, the FP, put them all together, they're all just like a tiny handful of the world's population. So we're obviously not relying, or I hope none of us are actually relying on just our own educational efforts, in means like this, or going out or chatting or down the pub having an argument or putting out a leaflet or whatever. We'll do that, everybody does it, but there's got to be some other material change, some other thing going on in the world that can lead from one thing to another. And that's where the crunch comes, I think, because I can't speak for everybody here, but most people that take the view that workers' councils in some form, assemblies in some form of workers, self-organised through the class struggle, it's significant because it is something, that exists, that we've got experience of, both historically and in our day-to-day experience, and it provides a link, psychologically as much as anything else, between workers with their ideas as they are now, workers with their ideas as they might be in the future, with the possibility of a leap into something different. It's a fucking big leap, isn't it, after all? There's got to be some kind of rift or rupture in the system to go from one situation to another. And that's why self-organisation of workers is so important, and why the electioneering approach in the here and now is inadequate. And because even though it might be by socialist candidates who are genuinely socialist, like the SPGB, even in that case, all it's doing is feeding in to an attitude, an atmosphere, and an approach that is prevails throughout society as it is now, which encourages working people not to look to their own self-organised activities in the day-to-day class struggle, but to look to other sources outside organisations, whether it's Parliament, their local MP, their local council, or their trade union boss or leader, or some other organisation or activity that they're not involved in on a day-to-day basis. And this is why it comes to a problem with the trade unions as well as Parliament. These two things are linked, because it's all right saying, well, we need industrial unions or trade unions, or they can, do for the workers economically. But historically, those institutions, which is what they are now, whatever function they had in the past, most of them have become integrated into the process of managing capitalism. So it's not just about Parliament, it's also about all the other institutions that we've grown up with that may have been bloody useful, may have been important in the development and struggle of the working class in the past, but over a long period of time, have become much more integrated into the process of managing the system. And that's what it's about, you know. Parliament, local councils and the trade unions, for the most part, along with certain other institutions, and the average tenants association probably, and all of those things, what they do and the way they function on a day-to-day basis is to manage the system. And managing the system is also about managing the people, you know, managing the workers as well. And you've got to break out of that somehow. The problem is, it can't be a nice gradual process. If there were any gradual processes, we would be closer towards a socialist society now than we were in 1904. And we're not. And my argument, I think the argument of some other people here, is that in fact what we've seen historically are ups and downs historically in the level of working class organisation, militancy and understanding. In some ways, you could argue that about 1904, but at various points in history there are probably more workers around that had at least a glimmer of understanding of what socialism is all about and its possibilities than there is now. Because it can't be a long, even process. And the other thing is, I mean, I accept that we may never get socialism or communism. I don't know what other people think here, but, you know, surely some older of us must have thought, well, hang on a minute, I've been fucking cracking away at this for God knows how long, and still no fucking near, right? So maybe it will never come. But you do have to ask yourself, you know, if it's a real thing, if it's really the case that it might never come, then what are we doing in the here and now? And it comes back to the same thing, is that even in terms of having some impact, for instance, in the current situation with all these austerity drives and all the rest of it, even to hold things back, even to make life a bit better for us, it's no good just us carrying on in the same old ways we have before, with the same old institutions. We have to make attempts to try and break out of that, even on a day-to-day basis. And that's living life now, and living life to survive now, and make something of ourselves collectively, both in terms of our material conditions and in terms of our bloody, you know, being able to hold our heads up high, you know, and not be ground down by the fucking system. And so there must be, and I believe there is, a connection between all those different things. And that's why it's so important. And as I said, I think Adam called it a concession. I don't think it was that. I tried to explain it. But as I said, I can't see the future. I don't know if in some circumstances the SPGB or some other group might even get some people elected. But what I think is that it's only likely to happen, even on a small scale, if workers are already doing all sorts of things. You know what I mean? That they're already involved in big struggles, big changes, big challenges all over the place. Not just the workplace, but, you know, in housing, culturally, you know, on the allotment, everywhere. You know, and if that sort of thing is happening, maybe some people will get elected. But the point is they'll already be creating means of representing themselves in all those circumstances. So that is where the power base is. That's where the real change has got to take place. Elections, one way or the other, you know, it might or it might not happen, but I don't see how anybody can actually predict it. And certainly what we don't want is a situation where people are primarily looking to that as a way forward. But it must be about people's own self-organisation in all those different fields. And that self-organisation it can't be through the existing institutions, because the institutions are already integrated. And people don't just change gradually. Things happen in spurts, you know, and it's like, well, you know, if things don't emerge on a big scale at a certain point, then people will relapse back into the old ways, and that's exactly what happened. People relapse back. You know, that's why most people don't get involved. Yeah, even in trade unions, if you want to say all that. Well, yeah, people get involved when there's some big issue, then people are up in arms. And then the trouble is, those trade union institutions that everybody's supposed to look to, they already got their ways of dealing with things. And you want something doing tomorrow, how do you do it? Because it doesn't happen then. And everybody gets involved. Everybody wants to do something then. But they're not going to, you know, you're not going to have mass participation in institutions that have been there for the last century and just carry on in the same old way that they all do. Everything will relapse back. So there are opportunities, there are situations where we've got potential to move forward, and there are situations when things roll back, and you've got to seize the opportunity. Really. Sorry, I'm waffling, but I did warn you.
Can you be chairman again now?
Well, I thought
Chairperson.
all right, I'll shut up and I'll check. Go on,
Well,
you go.
I was very interested to hear what you had to say there. We can't carrying on using the same old institutions. Well, the thing is that the socialist case is based on something fundamentally, radically and revolutionary different from what humanity has experienced before. So we are far from saying let's carry on in the same old way. We're fully in favour of people cooperating, coming together and forming their own organisations. We've said that we're in favour of, if you want to call them workers' councils or something like that, a way in which workers can organise for this really fundamental change from what's happened before. The only reason, the only basic reason why we're saying that Parliament should be used is because of the socialist principle of having democratic majority understanding amongst the people of what they don't want. In other words, the system that exists now. Sooner or later, if we get a revolutionary situation, people will realise that what exists now can never work in their own interests, and so they will collectively and democratically get together to say we don't want any of that anymore, and what is more, we know what we do want. A society of common ownership and a production for human need in their interests, the individual's interests, and in everybody's interests. Now, okay, we can use those workers' councils to spread ideas, to spread activity or everything like that, but we have got to be sure that in the parts of the world where this change takes place, and ultimately it must be on a global basis, we must be sure that we have got a majority of people behind us. Otherwise, there are going to be all types of problems. The old problems of past, dictatorship, and revolutionary groups organising, trying to change things, and finding out that because they're not a majority, the government can step in, send the troops in, or we know that's happened numerous times before. So if we can get people to understand that the only reason that we want to get control of, well, the main reasons are so that we can measure the majority of support for that revolutionary change and make sure that any force that in the past could have been used against the revolutionaries, very obviously the armed forces, will be under socialist control. Now, okay, I know that people will say that the armed forces, because of their training and the mindset that's been instilled in them, and many of them are loyal to the existing order, and that is certainly the case as we know today. But if you're getting into a real revolutionary democratic situation in which you've got ideas spreading fast, but particularly in a technological age like now, with all our smartphones and computers and things like that, things can change far more quickly than they could in the days of the Russian Revolution. We know that's obvious, isn't it? Now, these soldiers who might seem so reactionary revolutionary or hooligan-like, conservative-like. Now they're going to have friends who aren't soldiers. They're going to have relatives and all that, and they're going to be exposed to these revolutionary ideas. And okay, but the whole point is that you'll get the one situation that the ruling class have always been afraid of: instability in the armed forces, generals no longer being able to command their troops, and that would weaken the armed forces.
So that's not dependent though on having control of Parliament, is it?
Well, because
That's
for Parliament,
that's just dependent on
but
consideration.
Parliament
Would help from
is
your
the
point of view.
ultimate control.
Right,
Parliament
okay.
decides when we, in double inverted commas, go to war, or whether we don't go to war. And, obviously, in a socialist majority, we would never go to war again, apart from a class war.
Okay, anybody else want to... Sorry, who?
Yeah.
Yeah, at the back,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't see you.
Well, I was just going to say is the problem you have is people today, kind of like with the working class, you're talking about how do we kind of like get the mass thinking about these issues. I mean, a lot of people who I do community organising with, basically at the moment don't have the time and the energy to discuss things in the abstract. They're dealing with life in the here and now, and to a lot of them, life is really hard to just hold everything together. But what's really good is that quite often people are coming more together to realise there's a common thread to things, and they're coming outside of their boxes and starting to think not just about themselves and about their families, but thinking about other issues. But how you keep that momentum and that energy going, that it doesn't get co-opted and get taken over by people who use it for their own political ends, is the problem. It's like, I'm involved with like Birmingham Trades Council next week. We're doing a major national conference looking at the whole thing, the crisis in the National Health Service. Now the whole thing is we've got a whole load of folk who would never come to meetings like this, who are working in the health service, who are getting quite politicised and who are getting very aware of not just what's happening in the National Health Service, but what's happening overall with the coalition's austerity agenda. Now those people could easily just believe the people who stand up in front of them in that conference and just say, right, oh, well, we'll just leave it to them to sort it out. Because one of the things that we'll be discussing, I hope, next week will be the whole thing about the setting up a political party up called Save the National Health Service, which they're going to put up candidates in the general election for. Now that sounds great, but who are these candidates accountable to? Who's going to hold them accountable to make sure they don't get co-opted and taken in particularly by the Labour re-election campaign? But the thing is, workers, I think a lot of workers are realising that if they're going to get anything done now, they have to learn to do it for themselves. And one of the most inspiring examples I've read recently about is the cleaners in London mobilising and setting up their own union to get better conditions for the cleaners, and not working through traditional trade unions, but working through their own trade union. And one of the things that's been very helpful for getting that mobilisation going has been the use of modern technology, particularly through social networking, but also by the fact that these people have got their backs right against the wall, they've got nothing to lose, so let's go for it, let's kick the shit out of them. And basically, I really feel like, you know, until people kind of literally backs are against the wall, and basically there's just nowhere to go, a lot of people will just let things just slide and just let things go on. You know, they really got to kind of let back against the walls and shit hit the fan before people begin to realise what's going on. And you're talking about, you know, whether we're going to have the present system for much longer. I don't think we're going to have the system we're having at the moment for very long. You know, I think we have to quite seriously look at the possibility of by
I know what you mean. But all right, sorry. Yeah.
When I was going to say something else, but I think what you're saying is has lots and lots of truths in it. In there at the moment, for us to defend most basic things at the moment, people are looking at organising in new ways, and I think it actually gets back to the point that Mike made as well, that any effective struggle to defend anything at the moment isn't going to flow through the established organisations. That those organisations are all well embedded within the system, and you look at the relationships between the trade unions and the employers, trade unions and the local authorities, trade unions and the political parties. All of these are all enmeshed together, and while those frameworks are all in place, the reality is we're getting battered and ground down in ways that none of us would have thought was possible, say 20 years ago. You look at the attacks on benefits, the attacks on working conditions, the way we try to exist, and people are having to find new ways forward. Just I did want to say something though, just on the comrade over here, because I'm not using this as a critical point, but there's this interconnection between the SPGB's argument for standing candidates and voting in elections, and this point about the majority of people having to want socialism. Just going to call it majoritarian, not as a pejorative term, but just as to save having to say the same long sentence a dozen times. Because that argument, it seems to me, is a bit contentious, to put it mildly. I think everyone in this room would share the idea that the prevailing ideas within the society are that of the ruling class. Ruling class control the means of production of ideology. They're able to control the way we look at the world by and large, and it seems to me that it's a strange idea that somehow, through effort of will of the dozen people in this room and our kindred spirits, that somehow we will be able to turn that around, because assuming we all do it really well, and as Mike says, probably better than we have for the last several decades, then then perhaps we'll creep up, and there'll be 5%, and then 10%, and then 15%. But getting this majority business, do we really think that once we get up to about 42%, do we really think the ruling class will say, well, this is all right? There's about 42% who want to deprive us of the control of everything in the world, and boy oh boy, well, that's all right, because we'll just let it go on, and then sooner or later we'll get up to 48 and then 51, and then the bourgeoisie will say, well, that's it, there we are, it's all yours, we're going to retire to an island somewhere. Well, actually, no, I don't think that would happen. I think that if anyone sets out and starts to achieve this project, and then the bourgeoisie will very deliberately, once you get to a certain percentage, goodness knows what that will be or how they will measure it, that basically they would change the game. I think very quickly you would see that while they still control the state, if somehow we'd spent our time just looking at trying to develop consciousness, but not saying, well, the working class actually needs to develop its own organisations, then we're playing an incredibly losing game, which won't just end in tears, but will end in immense blood and hardship. The whole point, I think, that's coming out in this argument for worker self-organisation, as Mike puts it, is that it's not just, is that consciousness isn't something that expresses itself just in the way we think. That the development of consciousness is very much about the development of living struggle which in turn is linked to the development of our own organisations and of working class self-organisation. So I find this abstract. We need to elect the 326th MP, and that will reflect the fact that we've got 50.1% of the population wanting socialism. I actually can't really relate to that. I can relate to something that says as there's a massive interlinking between the development of working class consciousness and the development of working class self-organisation, and I think that's really at the nub of the argument for a view which says the working class can't take over the existing machinery, but something like workers' councils are the way forward.
Sorry.
Yeah, sort of on the subject of, it's been mentioned a couple of times about the unions being kind of entrenched in the system to one degree or another. We were talking about this kind of way up a little bit. I was kind of thinking, well, that we could have said that a few years ago. You know, the high point is the beer and sandwiches and at number 10 and all that stuff. But since then, that's gone into a decline. And I think the unions have been left out in the cold. However entrenched they have been in the past, they're not at all at the minute. In fact, you know, they're rump organisations, the unions, without virtually any clout whatsoever. And however imperfect the trade union form is or was, it's in its heyday, right? It's not been replaced with anything else now. Okay, there's and maybe that's just because class struggle is at an all-time low. I don't know if it is at an all-time low. It certainly appears to be class struggle as we know it. I don't know. I'm interested to see what people see developing. Obviously, the idea of the workers' council as a form is something that develops out of mass struggle. Okay, mass working class struggle. And it's interesting what you were saying, Mike, about, you know, maybe we won't get there, maybe things won't happen, you know. Sometimes you think, well, how do you, from where we are now, with very low levels of class consciousness, and there is, we can't kid ourselves on that. Right? The class consciousness is at a long time low, certainly in this country, I don't know about other places, you know. So, the unions have totally disintegrated and are now rump organisations. You haven't got any friends in the Labour Party, pretty much, you know, and but there's nothing else. Industrial organisation of workers, however lame it might have been, you know, there was industrial organisation. Now there's hardly any. In fact, you'll even find that trade union reps are actually pushing the more radical line, you know, whereas that might have been the opposite a few years back, you know, and that had union reps trying to hold people back. So it's not exactly the same situation as it was, you know. I grew up on this idea of the unions that pimp negotiating the rate, you know, and is it firmly in the camp of the boss class, in one way or another. But I don't think it's as simple as that anymore. So how do people see us going from where we are now with the low level of class struggle now to getting to some point where you have a higher level of class consciousness, or is that something completely outside of the control of, well, certainly out of control of us, 15 people sitting in this room, right? But I'm talking about as a class. How do we get from one thing to another?
Sorry,
Well, it's only two. I mean, you know, you put a caricature of our position. I mean, even this, you know, any socialist vote would be a reflection of people also organising themselves democratically, and so you're faced with with the same position, that there'll be 20% of people organising themselves in workers' council, there'll be 30%, there'll be 40%, there'll be 50%. So it's you know, silly argument. But I think, in fact, I'm not sure that everybody here does agree that before you can have a socialist revolution, you have to have, like Mike says, a majority. You know, that means most people in favour of the revolution. I mean, presumably your position is you can start up with a minority and you end up with a majority. But I mean, that's where the danger comes in. The argument that I thought most people here did accept was that before you could have a social revolution, whatever form it takes, whether it's the workers' council or parliament or both or general strike or whatever, there has to be mass support for it, the support of the majority of the population. So, I mean, that's the position that we've always said. We just said that if you like, voting is icing on the cake. It'll be a reflection of the fact that people already are democratically self-organised, ready to take over and run society. But until you've got a majority of people, not a mathematical majority, but 1% at a time, until you've got to have. Well, you've got to have a mandate, if you like. If you're speaking parliamentary, you've got to have enough people, or sufficient majority of people, that want the change. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Because the other side, the opponents of the revolution, will say, look, you haven't got majority support. We've got this. We're going to use armed forces and suppression. But to come back to the basic point, this argument of 1%, 2%, 4%, 15%, 20% applies equally to organising in workers' councils as it does to organising anywhere else. But in any event, it isn't just putting an X on a thing. That would be, as I said, an expression of where people were already in terms of organising themselves ready to take over and run society. But I mean, to latch on to what he just said, I'm not here to defend trade unions, but I don't think they're quite as bad as some people in this room make out. We think they're completely anti-working class and should be smashed. I mean, that's all workers have got at the moment is trade unions for all their, for all their.
Sorry.
I've got 2 points. The first one is, of all my mates, the ones that actually do have work are either in part-time work or 0-hour contracts. So if you're going to work, you could be going and working with people that you wouldn't be working with the same people every time. Like, the only person you might know would be your boss. So how can you organise with people you don't know? People don't have that confidence to bring up these issues with people they don't know. So I don't know, I'm wondering what people's views are on the prospects of organising when you're going to a workplace and your co-workers each day could be different people that you don't know. And the other point I'd make is, oh, sorry.
No, after you.
Okay. As for the revolution, I think the general argument of the SPG would it be that for there to be socialism, first people have to want it and understand it. Is that correct?
Most people,
Yes, but my point would be, is the revolution necessarily a revolution for socialism, or is it more a negation of capitalism? Because for me, I would view the revolution as not being we want to establish socialism. It'd be more we want to get rid of capitalism, a negation rather than fighting for something.
That's a good point.
I don't know if hopefully it might sort of go some way to answer your first point about how people can organise themselves in a culture where you're on shift with a different set of people every week, and you don't have that same kind of sort of cohesiveness that you do in the sort of the stereotypical, sort of factory kind of setting where you work with the same people or working with the same people in the office. And I suppose that sort of made me think of a point that's sort of been in my head for most of the meeting about how there's a risk of, and I'm not accusing anyone in the room of doing this, but of sort of having a definition of workers' councils or that kind of economic organisation which is sort of rooted in the past and in how people sort of traditionally organised if they were in one job role for a long amount of time, and everyone they knew was in the same kind of job role. You've got that sort of stereotype about the sort of mining village, if you like, where all of the production is sort of focused on one trade, and then that sort of focuses people's mind on a particular kind of production. But as you say, that kind of workforce organisation doesn't apply quite so much these days, and people are much more atomised and less focused on their work than they used to be. And I suppose, if anything, the thing which could potentially replace that in order to allow a rise in class consciousness
would be, I think that's something that Vince hinted at earlier, the sort of the rise of social media and technology as a way of sort of facilitating working class organisation. I mean, you saw that with some of the revolts in North Africa, where a lot of the demonstrations and protests were organised through mobile phones, Facebook, that kind of organisation. And I suppose if the working class as a whole can find a way of using technology to organise ourselves democratically, then that might be sort of like a mechanism for having that same kind of cohesiveness, not sort of geographical cohesiveness or cohesiveness focused on a particular trade or a particular lifestyle even. Obviously, the way social media works is much more diffuse than that. It applies to you sort of focusing on your particular interests, and that's where you sort of look on the internet or look on things like Twitter or Facebook. So I think maybe that kind of technology is what the working class should focus on as a way of using that in a democratic way to sort of galvanise support and get that kind of class consciousness and that kind of cohesiveness back. So I suppose that was a point I wanted to make sort of early, but I didn't really have the opportunity. Maybe I don't know if that goes some way to answer your first point. I can't remember what your second one is. Sorry.
My second one was the SPG position, as I understand it, is for there to be socialism or revolution, it has to be something which people understand or in favour of. But against that, I would argue, if there is a revolution, perhaps it's not so much a revolution for socialism, more a revolution against capitalism.
I suppose, chip in as somebody else wants to.
Well, can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
well, I think it's a good point in a way, because it kind of maybe overlaps with some points that I've made and that you've made about the relationship between consciousness and activity, of practical struggle. And I mean that, we can get a bit fixated sometimes because we're all in kind of groups with which are, for want of a better word, ideologically based. We've got a very clear set of a clear analysis, a clear set of objectives. We use a certain language, even most of it's been commonly used here. We use the same sort of language, the same sort of phraseology to describe what we're talking about and all the rest of it. And sometimes I tend to think, well, what we were talking about before was really about how people engage in struggle to defend their interests in the first place, and then to try and advance those interests. And sometimes the more people come together in the process of an actual struggle, the more they will start to, or historically have, tried to create a change in the material conditions in which they operate. So it's not that they're necessarily consciously, there might be class conscious up to a point. It might be a growing class consciousness. Oh, we've got the same interests, Oh, it doesn't matter whether we're an oil worker or unemployed or whatever, but because the organisational activity is actually bringing people together. So it brings people together. People in the process of coming together realise they've got common interests, and then they try and organise together to extend those common interests. So sometimes I tend to see a revolutionary process as being people actually doing things, actually creating common activity out beyond the framework of wage labour and commodity production and money and the market and the other under the organisational forms that people are used to in everyday life. And people can do that without perhaps understanding the full implications of what it would mean to carry on doing it. At some point, consciousness is about becoming aware of what you've already done and what the possibilities are if you carry on doing it. It doesn't necessarily mean that people will understand socialism as a thing. It's not like a thing to be introduced some way off in the distant future. It's about extending your activity in the class struggle to a point where there's a kind of decision to be made about where you go next and what you're actually going to do. In that situation, hopefully there would be people around with socialist ideas, who could, could help galvanise that. But all I'm saying is, I think a lot of people, the idea of a communist consciousness, it's something late in the day. It's really not something that you build up on kind of building block basis, and then eventually you've got a certain number of people and you can introduce a thing called socialism. It's something that emerges out of that process. And that's a different way of looking at consciousness. Even now, and I know the SPGB has sort of picked up on this a bit. There are other people going around, and they use different terminology. There's a whole load of people going around, and they're not my policies, by the way, I've got criticisms of them, but there's other people going around talking about the commons, what's that all about, but even the language, it's like people use different language, they're trying to express something that they feel is needed or that they've got in common. That can happen now. And certainly, if come back to this a bit bigger point, if we ever get to a point of sort of where struggle is happening on a big scale, on a wide scale, and across countries, then are they even going to be talking about social economy? They might just be talking about what it means in a practical way, if you see what I mean, with it using a different language than we even use. I don't know. That's why I'm always very cautious about, when people talk about what do you mean communist? What do they actually mean? Does it just mean everybody understands the SPGB case or the CWO case, or that we all understand how wage labour and commodity production work, and we rejected it intellectually, or I doubt it somehow. That might be mixed in there somewhere, but I can't see it being the big motivating force. By the way, that might be nothing to do with, but I thought, what you said sort of triggered that off in my mind, that it kind of linked with something I was trying to get my head around,
Yeah, a couple of points actually. The first one about we know what we're against. It's the socialist revolution against capitalism, the society that we've got now, or is it in favour of socialism, or is it a combination of the two? I think the first thing we could say about that is that obviously most people don't know what socialism is in the first place, or they've got huge misconceptions of it. They think that it's already been tried by the Labour Party or by the Bolsheviks and it's failed. That's most people's perception of socialism. The one thing that they have got a definite perception of and experience of is the society that we live under in capitalism. Now, as we well know, about 30 or 40 years ago, many people would have been more or less complacently satisfied when we were going through the post-war upturn in the economy, and very complacently minded, yes, okay, but they thought that things were getting better, and so there was a general support of capitalism, perhaps in a more positive way, certainly compared with now. Now they've found out that things are quite different from that, and many people, as we well know, are pretty fundamentally dissatisfied with the system, and so yes, clearly the first part of what you said about is this a revolution against capitalism, or will it be a revolution against capitalism? Well, you could say that now, yes, because not many people are saying, oh, what a wonderful society we live in. Isn't everything hunky-dory? That people are not saying or thinking of that. So, yes, a socialist revolution would be against the existing order. And of course, because we haven't experienced socialism, we're talking about it, yes, okay, to use our critics' terminology, in an abstract way. We can't do anything else because socialism, as we envisage it, has never existed. But what we've done is we look around the world, we see what the resources are for building up a better society and providing for human need and all things like that. And we say, yes, this can be done. But we can't point to a single part of the world where it's happening now. We can't point to a period in history where it happened on a large enough scale. We can perhaps look at communes in the past where people help one another out. But what we're talking about is a mass global world society in which the fundamental human need problems are solved. Not a paradise world in which everybody's going to be smiling all the time, but in which the fundamental problems are tackled. Now, but people, I'm sure, can understand that, but we're still talking about it in abstract terms, so we can't touch it, where, unlike the situation now, where we can experience that society. So the socialist revolution is going to be about those two things, fundamental rejection of capitalism and positive acceptance, striving for socialism. The other thing that you raised there about having different workmates or managers, and Mike came back with the atomisation. A lot of people are living individual lives, and perhaps they have a little bit less communication in the physical sense compared with what they might have had 40 or 50 years ago. So this wonderful thing called the internet comes along, and perhaps we all felt that when the internet really started becoming more widespread, that this might be a pretty significant tool for spreading socialist ideas in opposition to capitalism. The interesting thing is that so far it's not really turned out like that, has it? We've got our socialist groups and groups, the Greens, environmentalists, and spreading their ideas to a certain extent. But I don't think we can really say that ideas from socialism or communism, if you like, have stepped up significantly because of the internet up to now. But I don't think that need be the case for the future, because as capitalism continues to create its problems, and the thing is that the capitalist politicians, they never do. We're supposed to, the economy is supposed to be picking up, but the capitalists, they and their politicians, they never tell you about the next slump that's going to come along. Then the economy picks up again for a while, and then the next slump comes along, and so on. And so all I'm saying is that I think mass communication on a far wider scale than we've ever had before in human history is a significant plus for us, that we can communicate and organise. The potential is there for people to spread these ideas. And with the help of all the problems of the system and people like us trying to present an alternative, with the internet as well, hopefully things will change.
Okay, Adam. Yeah. And
Your next.
no, I mean
Anybody else?
we need to ask ourselves why capitalism does continue. I mean, the anarcho-communist Alexander Berkman pointed out it's because people support capitalism. I mean, why capitalism continues today isn't because of the ruling class imposing it on us. It's because most people don't think it's possible to live without money. Don't think it's possible to have a society where you don't have employers, where you don't go out and work for wages. They don't think you can have a world without frontiers or armies and things like that. I mean, this is what keeps capitalism going. It's the ideas in people's minds. I mean, people, they're not actively supporting capitalism. They accept it and then they're aggressive. So that I don't think that a merely anti-capitalist revolution will be enough. In fact, I don't think you could say you would have a revolutionary situation unless people had already said, look, we don't want to live like we do under capitalism. We don't want to have to pay for the things we need to live. We don't want to be conscripted into armies. We don't want wars. We don't want poverty. I mean, people will have to. There must be some sort of changing people's ideas before you can even talk of a revolutionary situation. I think, in fact, would be the definition of a revolutionary situation. Actually, when people think that what they thought was impossible is possible. So I think you're going too far and saying it can be purely anti-capitalist. There must be some idea in people's minds as to what they want to put in place of it. I mean, it's pretty simple actually. We don't want the means of production owned by a minority class. We want it owned by everybody in common. We don't want production for the market for profit. We want production to satisfy people's needs. We want democratic control of society, industry, and we want distribution from each according to the ability to each according to needs. I mean, they're really simple, basic ideas which don't require reading 3 volumes of Capital or anything like that. I think there will need to be at least some minimal ideas like that before you can talk about a revolution.
Just chip in before you say that some of those things you're talking about, at least partially, have arisen amongst larger parts of the working class from time to time over the history of capitalism, but not in a gradual way. It's always been an up and down process.
Going back 30 or 40 years ago, you remember the campaign for free transport in London?
Whatever, I'm just saying that there's nothing, well, that's not the best example, but anyway, sorry.
I do want to come back to that and sort of tie in some of the recent contributions by saying where does the change in consciousness come from? If I don't accept that a revolution can't be predicated on anti-capitalism, or for a large number of people that the revolution wouldn't be against the system as it exists without necessarily having had a case made for what could be there, because it seems to me that it's the experience of the working class that convinces people of the alternatives to capitalism. It's not really about making the case for socialism, because the working class is perfectly capable through its own self-activity of generating all of the ideas that we're discussing here today, generating its own political consciousness that doesn't depend on the existence of some people having made a case for socialism at any point. From the non-SPGB comrades, I don't think there are any of us who think that that what we are doing is indispensable to the class. Even those of us who are in organisations, I think we all believe that the working class needs political organisations, that political organisations are useful tools of the working class. But I don't think any of us believe that any of the organisations that any of us might be in are indispensable to the working class. It seems to me that the SPGB has an idea that class struggle on its own will never get the working class to a socialist consciousness. Or now what's the phrase? That the working class is incapable of going beyond a trades union consciousness through its own struggles. And that seems to me to be the SPGB's position, that workers have to understand socialism as a set of positions, not as the self-activity of the working class. So this question of consciousness, how the working class generalises its consciousness, is something that I think is a real difference here between the people in the SPGB and the people outside of the SPGB. That I think we would all be agreed, I think, that the working class can generate what we would regard as a socialist or revolutionary consciousness on its own. It doesn't need revolutionaries in that process. Though I think we all think that revolutionaries are helpful in that process. But I don't think we think that actually it needs a party. Does it need a party? Yes, because the party is the working class, the revolutionaries in the working class trying to organise together. But does it need a specific organisation? No, I wouldn't think that any of us would think that it did, because we don't see those specific organisations as being the only source for the generalisation of consciousness. And it seems to me that the SPGB does. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a...
You're saying it's okay for you to understand socialism, but not for an ordinary member of the working class. It's too much for them. It's too much for them to understand what socialism is. But you can. You can. You're in a privileged position. You're one of the leaders, aren't you? You understand what socialism is, but those mucks out there, they don't have to know about socialism. All they got to do is struggle.
I'm
Sorry.
I don't know how you got that impression.
Well, let me just say this. I'll try and keep it as brief.
No, well, you were not very brief last time.
Well,
all right. Well, let someone else have a go. And by the way, it's coming up to 10 to 5. Round about 5 o'clock. I'm just going to ask Adam and Phil to summarise. Okay. So, sorry. I mean, you carry on if you want. I'm just saying. I think the comrades will feel slightly slighted by that.
Misunderstood what the gentleman was saying, but I thought he was saying, look, you've got to struggle, and somehow you'll get an understanding. It'll come to you out of the skies about what socialism is. But he understands socialism. It's okay for him to understand what socialism is. It's okay for the ordinary working man to also understand what socialism is. And the only way you can understand it is to be told what it is, for it to be explained to him. To be explained to him, as Adam has been saying.
Okay, well look, can I just let the comrade briefly?
So it's like very much a vanguardist position that he's taking.
Because I'm quite sure that's the opposite of what you're saying. So let the comrade briefly answer that, and then let you come in then. I'm sorry about that. Just hang on a minute. All right.
I don't think that that workers need to be told about socialism.
Yes, you do.
I think it's helpful if workers understand socialism.
You can understand it, but they can't. Why is it okay for you to understand what socialism is, but the worker is like a little added bonus?
Am I preventing workers understanding?
Well, you're saying they don't need to. You're saying, no, we don't need to. We don't have to tell us.
No, I'm saying that socialism is not a set of principles that you have to sign up to. Because if you're right, and socialism is a set of principles that people have to sign up to,
it's not about signing up to it. It's understanding the basis of capitalist society.
Where did socialism come as a theory come from?
You've had a go at it.
Where did socialism as a theory come from? Was it invented by the working class through their own struggles, and therefore any worker can come to socialism through their own struggles, or was it invented by socialist intellectuals? Because it seems to me that your position is that socialism is the gift of socialist intellectuals.
No, that's your position. Your position is
No.
I'm not going to tell anybody else.
No, listen. You obviously think each other's position is the opposite. So let's just, you're not going to agree. So, comrade denied what you're saying. So let's just leave it at that. Sorry, you want to come in?
Well, yeah, I was hoping to sort of come back to what you said, and if I've understood your arguments, I feel that it would be much better levied at sort of left-wing organisations or vanguard organisations than the SPGB. Because you seem to be sort of you seem to be accusing the SPGB of sort of fetishising itself as an organisation, and you seem to be accusing the SPGB of sort of overinflating its importance in contributing to workers' awareness. And if I've understood your argument correctly, my reply to that would be that well, I can only really speak personally, but my sort of awareness of the class struggle and my position in it sort of came when I started employment. So I had a fairly mundane office job, and I realised, is that it? Is that what my my life is leading up to? A job in an office, working for someone else's interests, the drudgery, the low pay, all the rest of all the rest of the sort of hallmarks of employment that I'm sure we're all aware of. So. My personal understanding of the class struggle initially came from a workplace situation and my reaction to that, and the SPGB was a way of sort of clarifying that position, or finding a language or finding a framework for the sort of emotions and thoughts I felt at the time. Obviously, I'm speaking personally; I can't speak for anyone else. But I wouldn't accept that the SPGB has sort of like an intellectual vanguardist position, which I think is what you're accusing us of. In that, and again, that accusation, that there are far more worthy targets than the SPGB of that, which always works to be democratic organisation without leaders that allows maximum contribution of its members, allows public meetings where anyone can attend. There's no secrecy within the SPGB. So I think you're sort of aiming your argument at the wrong target. And the SPGB, as we've said today, allows that in a revolutionary situation there'll be lots going on in terms of workers' councils having their role in the work in a revolutionary situation, as well as the parliamentary role, whatever that is. So I think, you're wrong to accuse the SPGB putting itself on a pedestal that we certainly don't aim for. We would say that our role in a pre-revolutionary situation is to spread awareness of the class struggle and various factors. And surely all of us in this room, whether or not we're in a particular organisation or not, we'd say that the most we can do in a pre-revolutionary situation is to sort of spread awareness and spread arguments and point things out about capitalism. So hopefully that replies to your arguments against the SPGB. Tell me if it doesn't. I think by the look on your face it doesn't.
I'm sorry, Mike. It
doesn't answer mine either. Can I just ask can I just ask a quick question in there, rather than have a talk? I know. You just don't want me to talk at all. It's not fair. Sorry, Mike. I'll come back to what you and Tony are saying there. Yes, we do have that impression because I don't see. I see more complexity in the arguments that you're presenting. I see more depth in the arguments that you're presenting now. But I struggle with this view that the socialist revolution is going to be achieved by voting the SPGB as socialist candidates into Parliament.
Not just that. That's just a part of it.
But you argue against the. There's more than one question, but you do keep saying that. It's all through the parliamentary leaflet. You've got to vote socialists into Parliament, and then everything else will fall into place. So the state will disintegrate, the ruling class will disintegrate because we can just banish them, because all power is in Parliament. And that is an intellectual, a persuasive process that the party has to perform. That's why I think we would argue from that point of view, and argue with Tony and what he was saying about ourselves. We see it as a natural process coming out of struggle and the self-activity and the confrontation with capitalism, with the ruling class, not as an intellectual process. So I don't understand how you justify your response to me there.
Do you want to put our case to them?
Well,
not me, you. You know he's wrong.
Yeah, no, yours is wrong.
I know he's wrong.
Just ask, if Mike can respond a bit more, that's all. If Mike or Tony want to respond a bit more.
Don't put me in, because
I was just asking for Mike or Tony to respond a bit more, because I think they're misunderstanding our position. I think I'm understanding theirs, but I'm probably not. So I'm just asking for a little bit more.
I can't speak for myself, but you seem to be saying, I've got some mind block about this. You seem to be saying, I accept that you understand what socialism is. I think I'm not.
We're agreeing. Yeah. It's a common ground,
but you're saying that the working class do not need to know. All the working class.
No, we're not. We're saying they do need to know. We are saying they do need to know. We are saying they can find out for themselves.
I don't believe you can find out for yourself.
So you do need to tell them. So you are saying you do need to tell them.
Well, they have
comes back to what's to be done and Lenin.
How do we acquire knowledge? How do we acquire the knowledge that we've got? Because teachers tell us things.
But where did your knowledge come from? And what's the first
cause?
cause?
Get wound up in some strange.
It's getting into a bit of a
discussion with
archaeology.
I think knowledge comes from reading and discussion within my own head about what I've read, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether it makes sense or not. By reading, by being taught, by discussing with people, an intellectual process. That's how I come to my conclusion. That's why I became a socialist, through that process. And I think you other people around in this room have done the same thing. And I'm saying, well, it's good enough for us, it's good enough for the working class.
Right, look. Just calm down a minute, because I want to.
Theory and practice.
No, I'll give you a go. But I'm just saying.
I'm calm.
The mix.
What time are we going to finish? Because
Yeah,
people
what
are
time
getting
do you want to
interested
finish?
now, but I'm having a go at each other, you know. Yeah, I never said that. No, yes, you did. Fucking crap, what you're coming out with.
We are clarifying things.
We're
as
trying
well.
to
I mean,
clarify
nobody's
things, but
getting
actually,
that
I think,
extreme
you know,
about
it's still
anything.
going
are
around
we?
in circles, really, but that's not the matter. Look,
I'm okay for a bit
not yet.
longer.
You
I
can
will-
sum
I
up.
want you to come back and
No.
I think.
You chip in now, and you've had a go.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
are we getting, and then anybody else other than you and you can come in, and then we're going to sum up.
Yeah, I think let everybody have their say. That's what I would
Yeah,
argue.
yeah, yeah. Okay, sure.
It's like a workers' council.
Don't disagree.
We insist on you saying something. No, look, hang on. Look. You come in now, anyway. But all I'm saying is, in about 5 or 10 minutes, I want to let the two speakers summarise, because I think we are going round in circles a bit. But probably what would be good is if from this meeting, people still go away and read stuff that other people have produced. Perhaps also, because I always push it, but I've tried to engage in a lot of discussion on the LibCom site on this with Adam and with comrades from the CWO and others. There have been 3 different discussion threads going on there that I've done my best to try and link up, because they cover all the sort of discussion that we've been talking about today. So I will promote that as something that I support. But so that's it. So sorry, off you go.
Look, the question that keeps popping back for me is who educates the educators. Now I want to qualify that a little bit, because without putting words in anyone's mouth, I think everyone here feels they have a degree of socialist consciousness and socialist awareness, and that we have a responsibility to share that with fellow workers. And in that sense, I think we all see ourselves as educators in the context of that sense, as we just said. Now that's not saying I am a Leninist who believes that the working class can't attain consciousness and that I have to teach it to them. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we're all aware socialists, and we believe that to help overthrow capitalism and move to a decent civilization, we need to encourage the process along. We need to encourage the working class towards that. Right, so in that context, in that sense, I think we're classifying ourselves as the educators. And the question is, who educates us? Where have and do we learn from? And to some extent, there's lots of books and there's lots of words, and that's really good. Because otherwise, all the previous generations of us...
Each generation would have to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly, yeah. Right, so I don't have to justify that one. Well, what I think this sort of side of the room, and the comrade over there, are sort of in the camp of, is saying, look, the real fundamental learning process is working class struggle. That's where socialism comes from. That's where the understanding of socialism comes from. That's where the understanding, if it's anything, is constantly enriched by, is the struggle of the working class. And that, I think, is a different emphasis, and I don't think it's a caricature. I think there's a different emphasis there. I think that's why we're tending, or why we, in this discussion, we've come from this concept of workers' councils, because we see that as being an expression of working class struggle, and why I think there's actually a disjuncture in the SPGB's position, because if you're able to, because the accommodation of parliamentarianism as part of that struggle tends to negate the understanding that it's actually independent class struggle, self-activity, self-organisation, which enables socialism both in theory and practice to develop. I'm trying to, that was wasn't quite what I wanted to say, but I think it was near enough.
Okay. All right, thanks. Now, if anybody else is desperate to say anything, I'll let you.
Can I
Right,
just say
go on,
one
yeah,
thing? Can I just say one thing, Chair? What do we want? Socialism. When do we want it?
Yeah.
But a pint, I love it. You know, I've got low expectations at the moment. But okay, well, is there anybody else? Because I thought that was pretty good. Sorry,
When it was earlier on, you said you might never have communism, which I thought that myself. But of course, it depends on the material conditions. Will the working class rise up? Does it have to get really bad before we do something about it?
Maybe. Well, it was sort of touched on a little bit earlier when we were talking about condition. Actually, Comrade over there mentioned about the economic conditions.
Why in the 50s, 60s, the perception was no need for it because everyone was getting richer, and now we live in a situation where the majority of the working class are going to get poorer.
Yeah, I think that it's a really. I don't think we've got time to go into all of that, but it's a really good question because. Sorry, go on.
But the 70s, people were getting better off then, and yet that was a high point of working class activity, probably.
Well, there's an argument about what was happening with the economy and whether it was the beginning, whether it was the high point or the beginning of a downturn. There's a whole economic analysis which you could argue about around what was going on in the 70s. So that's but really not going to have to go into that now. I mean, the other thing though is even if we say, which I tend to think, you know, a downturn in the economy, particularly on a world scale, such as we've got now, would in theory be a time, to some extent what people have alluded to, would be a time when you would expect more working class struggle and more reflection on how crap the system is and looking for alternatives. And some people just, well, that's happening, but
that is slowly going to happen.
Sorry?
That is slowly going to happen, isn't it?
It's happening up to a point, and I mean, the issue would be, well, why isn't it happening more? And you could say, well, you know, you could look at Greece and you know, places where it's really bad. And there's a big struggle, and there are big, you know, there are big assemblies. There's people going on strike. There's all sorts going on, but certainly haven't made a breakthrough to the point where the system is threatened. So there's a whole other set of argument discussions to have. Is, well, what other factors are ongoing in the way that capitalism operates that stops people from making that kind of psychological breakthrough beyond, you know, beyond the everyday class struggle? But really, it's a huge area. It's a huge area in which not just the practical experience of the class struggle, but psychology and how capitalism today is different than it was 100 years ago, and all sorts of things could come into that debate. Perhaps this meeting should consider having some kind of discussion like that, because I find it interesting, but it's huge, you know what I mean?
Given the crisis of the 70s, and yet we still haven't really come out of that from what I read. But also at the same time as the crisis of the 70s in the West, the same happened as well in the Soviet Union. At the same time, they went for a crisis in the 70s as well. And I only come reading bits, and I'm trying to put things together, and I needed to be more explain why they were having problems in the 70s as well as we were having problems.
World crisis.
I really
if anyone could enlighten me on that.
Do we really? Sorry, I'm going to take a consensus here, because this is another.
That should be.
I know it's connected, but it's a whole. It would be great to have a more extensive discussion around the kind of some of the things that you've raised here. You know, with comrades from different, you know, different organisations and tendencies. I'd love to have that, but otherwise, you want to have a quick. I'm just going to be really quick.
Because quick one. Yeah.
Very quick and quick.
I will be very quick.
So you go and then you, and then I think we'll better call it day then.
Right, it's not coming up with any sort of magic solutions here, but I think one of the problems is, I mean, Adam pointed out earlier on that majority of people support capitalism, and there's a lot of discontent amongst the population at the moment. They're certainly not the happy people were a few years ago, a few decades ago, but it seems to me that discontent seems to be channeled into giving critical support to capitalism. You know, this is due to the sort of lack of struggle and lack of consciousness at the moment. It seems to be being channeled into various sorts of, you know, campaigns type people, like the thing on Europe, for example, or immigration, all sorts of reactionary sorts of things. And never ever underestimate the enemy class in that distracting people or diverting people's attention. There seems to be a real divide and rule at the moment, you know. Unemployed versus unemployed, public versus private sector workers, disabled versus abled, gays and straights. They're using every trick in the book to try and put all these diversionary tactics and all these things. You know, things like, say, social media. You know, I think you're dead right, it could be used as a vehicle for extending ideas. It's being totally wasted at the moment. There are all sorts of trivia and trash and reactionary ideas being put through it. It's like, you know, discontent at the moment seems to be being channeled into these sort of reactionary dead-end things, you know. And I think that's part and parcel to, you know, addressing ourselves to this and what can be done about it. You know, because we have to start where we are at the moment. You know, whether you're a class-conscious socialist or whether you're a worker or whatever you are. You know, we have to start from where we are at the moment. I think this is one of the major obstacles that you sort of have to, you know, it's, I don't know, it's sort of paralysis really. You know, things like, for example,
Quick.
there's 75% of people want foreign aid to be diverted into floods and all this sort of thing, or most people want a referendum on Europe, you know, it's sort of things that the press are making big things out of, you know, which we regard as diversionary.
That'd be everything you see in the opinion polls. Anyway.
Right, I come back on what we were discussing before about workers' councils and the class struggle leading to an understanding of socialism. I would like to know why in the same thing couldn't be said about it could lead to workers becoming fascists and fascism. Unless there's an education process, unless you're directing people, I think everybody here, before they became socialists, must have been advised, told to read and discuss certain aspects of socialism. They would never have become socialists. So workers' councils and the class struggle may lead to everybody becoming socialists. I doubt it, but and I think there are instances in history of it leading to people becoming fascists.
That could happen anyway, it won't be because of all
I finished. It might this and it might that, okay. I think we've done now then, so Adam, do you want to brief?
Okay, yeah. Well,
then Phil.
I think the second part of the meeting was more interesting than the first, because in the first we were just going back 100 years over Russia, which I don't think is what happened there. I don't think it's particularly relevant. And we're also discussing what Marx said or didn't say, which once again is maybe interesting, but not strictly relevant. But I think in the second part we did get down to what it's about. And the argument is, which we've just been having, do workers learn purely from experience, which I think is the argument that's been put over here. But
no, it's not.
Hold on a second. But do they learn purely from the experience of struggle? I don't think that's the case. Workers do learn from experience, but part of the experience is hearing the case for social, or hearing socialist arguments, and all this stuff there. I mean, only a small portion of it is produced by the SPGB. Other people are doing the same thing, because people learn. Well, part of learning experience is hearing arguments, and somebody said, you know, reading books and listening to other people. I mean, I think you can confirm that there have been examples of you know, workers' councils which have not been socialist. I mean, to go back to ancient history again, to Germany after the First World War, the only successful political strike in Great Britain was the Ulster workers' strike. So there's no necessary evolution between pure struggle on its own, and I think, in fact, I suppose we're being honest and admitting what we're doing, that we sort of distilled in the past experience of the working class into socialist principles or socialist analysis of capitalism, and we're making that part of the workers' experience, which we hope will evolve. So in fact, I think we basically agree that what the role of a socialist organisation, or any organisation, social organisation, revolutionary one, is to put before people explanation as to why capitalism you know, doesn't work in their interests. I mean, you know, we take the same point of view as you. I mean, you know, there may be people in here who agree with Lenin's "What is to be done," in which he said the working class only capable of reaching a trade union consciousness, and socialist consciousness has to be brought to them by from outside, by middle class intellectuals. But I mean, that's not our position, and it's it's not the case. Even Marx learned his socialist ideas from attending workers' meetings in Paris in the 1840s. So, what I think the role of socialists is not to create social understanding, but to help it, to hasten it. I mean, it maybe eventually, if we said nothing, all the socialists in the world, all the socialists in the world did nothing, socialist consciousness would arise. It probably would, but it'd probably be slower than so. That's what the role of socialists is. It's not to create socialist consciousness, but it's to help it and to hasten it by, as I say, putting over the past experience of workers. It's not going to come. This is actually a philosophical problem. Nobody can learn anything by pure experience. We're human beings that think. So some part of the process of learning has to involve thinking about things. And I think if there aren't people there to point out what's wrong with capitalism and so on, people go into strikes and they'll come up with the same ideas. Part of the experience has to be hearing the case for socialism. Well, how much longer have I got? Do we need to go back and mention workers' councils again? No. But the thing is, the argument is people are saying we're saying workers' councils are essentially economic organisations, and other people are saying that they're political organisations. But what you're saying is, in fact, that workers' councils should engage in politics and somehow try to ignore or bypass or confront or take on the state of the workers' militias and so on. But that is a political role, but it's not a very intelligent political role. Politics doesn't just mean talking about society in its normal sense. It means something to do with the state, and you can't ignore the state. You've got to organise. We've got to organise to take over the state and not to use it in its actual existing form. I think the phrase that was used by Marx and Engels in 1871 was, "You lop off the undemocratic part of the state before you can use it." He wasn't saying you should smash it completely. Anyway, I've now contradicted myself by going back and talking about the uninteresting first part of the meeting about what somebody said in some historical figure said. Yep, that's it.
Okay, thanks. Bill, do you want to?
Yeah.
Do a quickie?
Yep, struggling. I was interesting discussions all the way through. I'm not so critical of the first part of the discussion, partly because I set that off really with my presentation, but because I think looking at history and learning from history and what workers have done in the past is a key to understanding what workers can do in the future. So that was my approach with that. I'm interested that. With the second part, we're really discussing about the role of consciousness and how consciousness of socialism develops in the working class. And right at the end, we've come to more that's an issue of the role of militants and the role of the political party, where in actual fact, once we get away from the silly bits, we've got quite a lot of agreement in there. The element of consciousness develops, I think, that aspect of it still needs further, it's still open for further discussion, because I'm still concerned that, because I liked Mike's points he was making about people's own self-organisation and the fact that people get involved in doing things as a revolutionary situation develops. They don't necessarily have a socialist consciousness, but they are very much against what capitalism is now or at that point in time, and start to react accordingly and get involved in organising themselves in whatever particular issues are floating around at that point in time. And out of that we're seeing coming a growing political consciousness, a growing, maybe not socialist, but becoming socialist, a revolutionary consciousness. I think that's really important. So I'm still concerned that there's an argument that seeing workers' councils as primarily an economic struggle, as a product of economic struggle, or simply having an economic function. And I've still got to say that is the SPGB arguing against that or not? Certainly the Parliament pamphlet puts it that workers' councils really only come out after the revolution, after a socialist party has taken over in Parliament to reorganise the workplace. That's really what the argument in there is in there. I want to emphasise more the economic and the political role of those of workers' councils, and the capacity of them as they develop to oppose themselves to the state. Yes, as Adam is ending there, we do need to address the issue of power in the state, but that issue is addressed by the capacity of workers' councils to take on that power themselves. And I guess that's the bit I want to emphasise coming out of there. No, go on.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that. No, sorry. There's another aspect to it, I suppose, is the institutions of state and state in capitalism. We haven't really addressed that in discussion, and maybe that's a bit of a weakness. This idea that how powerful Parliament is in the capitalist state, and what else exists there, really. Because for me, there are other factions. The ruling class is much more than just a parliamentary institution. So. But that wasn't tackled really. We haven't dealt with that area, so I just mentioned that. Finished.
Thanks everybody. Hopefully there may be some other discussions in the future that might broaden things out and maybe not get too fixated on the one item. Okay.
Thank you.
I don't know, some people may be staying for